context to the situation, let's look back at Sony's history with the game industry. Original.
Yo!
Video games.
Just watching somebody else's video for this one and passing it on to you and commenting on it. I've gone over this. This is the 5th generation that he's talking about, and, you know, this is history, so...
What up, dudes? Matt here from YoVideogames. By popular request from the recent Sony State of Mech video, I'm going to be doing a real talk about Sony as a games publisher, and more specifically, the return of arrogant Sony, and why that is bad for the industry. To bring a little context to the situation, let's look back at Sony's history with the game industry. Originally born out of plans with Nintendo in the late 80s, Sony at one point was going to create a CD-based add-on for the Super NES. The deal ultimately fell through when Nintendo's president at the time, the notoriously cutthroat Hiroshi Yamauchi, combed through the deal and saw that Nintendo was not going to have control or revenue off of the CDs made for the Nintendo PlayStation, unlike the way they had been doing with cartridges for their other home consoles. For a brief moment after the deal fell through with Nintendo, Tom Kalinske of Sega of America tried to convince Sega of Japan to jump into a partnership with Sony for their next console, which Sega of Japan thought was a stupid idea since Sony had no history at making video game hardware or software. This frustrated Kalinske, who could see the writing on the wall, while Sega was all too happy to dive headfirst into being complete fucking morons until their ultimate collapse and merger with Sammy Incorporated. Going it alone, Sony then decided it would make its own exclusive consoles, blackjack and hookers excluded, and release it in late 1994 in Japan, right around the same time as the Sega Saturn. When Sony was new to the game, they knew they had to go out of their way to appease third-party developers, Namco being a big partner, while also making strides with Konami, Williams, Capcom, and various other European developers such as Psygnosis. The biggest coup would be shortly after the launch by taking away two of Nintendo's most successful and loyal third parties, Squaresoft and Enix. The Japanese launch was a massive and surprise success, and 9 months later it was poised to repeat it in America and Europe. Even after such a short time, however, Sony was already blocking content. In the early years of PlayStation's life in North America, noted ass clown Bernie Stolar was to handle distribution of the console in the West. Stolar had been quoted as saying Sony wanted to approve nearly anything that came out, but he wanted to maintain a quality brand image for the console. While this may sound good, Stolar was instrumental in blocking the release of games that were purely 2D at the time, as well as reportedly putting a no RPG hard stance on releases in North America. Bernie was not long for his time at Sony and was later snapped up by Sega after they had successfully drove off the team responsible for their largest successful years in the company's history with the Genesis. Stolar took his shit-ass stances with him and famously killed the Saturn prematurely in North America to focus on their next console. Sony would continue to rise in popularity thanks to games like Final Fantasy VII and Symphony of the Night, two all-time classics that may not have been if Stolar had stuck around. By the end of the 90s, Sony was riding very high on its success. The PlayStation had become one of the most successful consoles of all time, far outselling any of Nintendo's home consoles before it, and the general gaming audience was eager for its follow-up with the PS2, especially with the DVD playback capabilities.
Yes.
However, with the rise of PlayStation's success would also bring the rise of arrogant Sony.
Yep.
While Sony was extremely forthcoming and eager to help get developers on board the first PlayStation, it was a different story when it came to the PS2. Nowhere was this more famous than when Shinji Mikami, of Resident Evil fame, told the story of during the original Devil May Cry's development, he reached out for tech support by Sony for the new PS2 system, something they had been happy to help with on titles for the original PlayStation. Sony apparently told them to figure it out themselves because where else were they going to go? This led to a failed meeting with Microsoft and ultimately Mikami's decision to completely take the Resident Evil franchise away from Sony and make it a Nintendo exclusive. This would not be the end of Sony's arrogant assholery during the PS2 era. Longtime RPG publisher Working Designs was known for their lavish releases of obscure Japanese titles.
And we love
them for it. They had plans to release the Growlancer series of tactical RPG games in the USA. However, there was a problem with Sony approval. Growlancer was a game that was almost entirely 2D, and somehow the stench of Bernie's asshole apparently lingered on at SCEA.
Yep.
Sony refused to allow Working Designs to release the Growlancer titles separately, despite how fancy their box sets were. This caused a years-long delay and forced the company to bundle the Growlancer games into a collection. This loss of revenue and releases would eventually put Working Designs under, as they were never able to fully recover from it.
Oh my god, they
killed... But it wouldn't stop with just Working Designs.
This is... My god, I didn't realize Sony itself was responsible for the death of working designs with that one. Jesus. Yeah, I would have bought Girl Lancer. I look, working designs' failure is one of the biggest tragedies in the history of gaming, as far as I'm concerned. I bought Lunar. In fact, I've been so passionate about Lunar. I've gone on the record to say that I support and like the original plot and lore of Lunar 1 on the Sega CD, and I applaud Lunar 2 for being as faithful to the original, the remaster on the PlayStation, because I didn't like the retconning on 1 and everything. And a lot of people do. A lot of people, they looked at that and they thought, oh, they made the characters better and they improved them and everything. Their personalities came out a lot more and came to life. But, these characters were better when their personalities were muted somewhat because, they all had really obnoxious ones that became very annoying and frustrating at times, just as a player of it and everything. And they, in the original Nash, it does something where he looks initially like a traitor, but ends up being a big hero and everything that delivers some of your most needed and vital equipment to you and everything, and gives you a massive victory over Galleon and everything, where he pretended to go over to the dark side just to betray it in the end and fight it from within because he thought that would be more effective. And so he leaves your party and everything in the original, but he comes back to it, eventually, and, he proves himself to be one hell of a hero, at that point, and that he was never the coward that he was made out to be. He did one of the most risky jobs possible and everything, and you just thought badly of him at first and everything as a person because you thought you'd been betrayed, but you hadn't truly. He had to make it look like it was real, and he had so much so that it convinced Alex and the rest of the team that they had truly been betrayed, But he makes it up to them and everything, and, it's incredible. It's a huge, legendary moment in the original, and they ruined it. They fucked it all up. They made all the characters a lot worse than they really were and everything, and the retcons were not well received, to say the least. So, when I recommend Lunar to people, I tell them go out, get the Sega CD, or emulate it, play it that way, and everything. I don't recommend a PlayStation version of it. I mean, when I said how I felt, the only defense that I got of it was but the bromides, and I love fan service as much as any other pervert, but I just don't feel it was worth it for the story edits. I prefer the original. So, I look back on this moment, and I didn't realize Sony was responsible for that. But I'm gonna have to rewind that and watch what happened. Girl Lancer was a tactical RPG. I would have given it a shot. It's definitely within my school of game.
Nowhere was this more famous than when Shinji Mikami, of Resident Evil fame, told the story of during the original Devil May Cry's development, he reached out for tech support by Sony for the new PS2 system, something they had been happy to help with on titles for the original PlayStation. Sony apparently told them to figure it out themselves because where else were they going to go? This led to a failed meeting with Microsoft and ultimately Mikami's decision to completely take the Resident Evil franchise away from Sony and make it a Nintendo exclusive. This would not be the end of Sony's arrogant assholery during the PS2 era. Longtime RPG publisher Working Designs was known for their lavish releases of obscure Japanese titles. They had plans to release the Grow Lancer series of tactical RPG games.
Jesus, this looks awesome. I totally would have played it.
However, there was a problem with Sony approval. Grow Lancer was a game that was almost entirely 2D, and somehow the stench of Bernie's asshole apparently lingered on at SCEA. Sony refused to allow Working Designs to release the Grow Lancer titles separately, despite how fancy their box sets were. This caused a years-long delay and forced the company to bundle the Grow Lancer games into a collection. This loss of revenue and releases would eventually put Working Designs under, as they were never able to fully recover from it. But it wouldn't stop with just Working Designs. Sony would also fail to approve the North American release of SNK vs. Capcom Chaos, as well as Metal Slug 3. They would approve SNK titles if they were at least combined or part of a collection, but this resulted in both SVC Chaos and Metal Slug 3 console releases to be Xbox
on this
exclusive.
one as a gamer, okay? And it's going to be my cold take in the future because it's not going to change. There's nothing about this take that is so controversial that, Well, it may be, but even if it is, I don't give a shit. I don't give a rat's ass. I embrace the controversy. You can hate me all you want for it. I'm not going to change my opinion. It is my opinion. It's set in stone. There's nothing you can say that will ever change my mind. But a company that releases a video game console should have... In fact, it should be legally required that it has no right to disapprove of anything. In fact, if anybody wants to make a game for it, they don't even have to ask them for permission. They can just offer it, and they have no authority whatsoever to deny it. And if they don't like it, they can bow down and suck the U.S. government's dick. They have no power, no recourse. Tough shit. Cope, assholes. That's your option. That is what companies should have to deal with. And by the way, this is why PC gaming ends up kicking the snot out of console gaming. Because nobody has to ask for permission to release a game on the PC. Doesn't matter if somebody disapproves of it. There's nobody that has the authority to say no. So, really, the console should operate that way too. Sony should not have an approval process. The approval process should be, if you want to make a game for it, it's greenlighted automatically. You want to take the risk, then it's approved. Period.
Exclusives in North America. Sony felt that the games looked and felt too dated and without enough improvements or additions to approve the release for North America. As a side note, Sony also forced Acclaim to alter the content of BMX XXX for the PS2 version, thereby making the Xbox and Nintendo GameCube versions completely unaltered and featuring all the messy, blocky nudity Sony would not allow on the PS2. The PS2 would go on to be even more successful than the PS1, and Sony doubled down on their popularity with the release of the PS3. Karma would eventually catch up with them, however, as their debut of the system at E3 is still lambasted to this day. Sony at the time was unfazed by concerns of the new system, even going so far as to say people should work another job to afford their system, and calling it the luxury car of the game industry. Luckily, people weren't so quick to bite last generation, and for a time, Sony lagged woefully behind Microsoft and Nintendo. It even got to a point where there were more Wii balance boards sold than PS3s in the world. Sony would go on to recover from this and slowly made the PS3 a console worth owning.
Me, myself, this was an era where, to be honest with you, my interest in gaming had been in a waning period and a phase. See, to be honest with you, the same tendency on my part is why I only just recently got my hands on a 3DS and everything, and I'm going to have to dive into that world now and see what's going on in that world and went on in that world. You know, and the reason for this is because I'm not a consistent gamer. I've got too many hobbies. I do too many things. You know, like famously, I've gone on the record to talk about how I'm reading a Soto's 86. You know, I'm all over Goodreads and everything. I'm doing a lot of things, reading The Atlantic, doing a bunch of other things, you know, reacting to things, writing poetry, doing 1,000 different things all at the same time, and back and forth between all my hobbies, because I like to shake it up. I don't like to do one thing for a long period of time. And anyways, so this right here, this reaction, when the market was going through this turmoil, I was completely disengaged. I was not watching what was going on. You know, but, you know, I can totally see why the market had a negative reaction to this one at the time. You know, I can totally see it. And, you know, those prices in today's terms may be, you know, a little bit less of a problem, but you have to keep in mind when this launched. You have to keep in mind when this happened and that these higher prices were not normalized or justified at all by things like the pandemic or anything else, you know? There's no supply chain shortages. There's no shipping lanes being clogged up or expensive. There's no... The shipping companies at this date had spent a ton of money on infrastructure because they thought the e-commerce revolution was going to continue and that we were going to see another 17% growth period for the next years to come, and so they bought a whole bunch of infrastructure to prepare for demand that never materialized, and now they're passing the shipping cost off to your customers, like I have to deal with at my eBay company. I've got a customer that's interested in one of my products, and, you know, I would ship it to him, but it's going to cost him $80. He doesn't want to do it, you know? really, it's going to cost me $96, and I'm just basically discounting the shipping $16, because that's what I quoted it as and estimated at first. And so I'm fine with that, but he doesn't want to pay it, so I lose a sale, and everything. And, shipping costs are high. And so, I look at this price and I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, if you estimate what it would cost plus shipping, yeah, I mean, but this is just for the console itself, so that's a bit of an issue and everything. And the PlayStation 3 is, historically, when I look back on it, I can't find much on it that I really want to play and everything. It does kind of seem like this was the moment in which, the sheer amount of third-party developer support kind of fell off a cliff, and when the arrogance started to show up in the first place, they had ridden high off of 2 generations of it. Didn't realize that on the PlayStation 2 they killed working designs, though. So now I've got something that really makes me hate Sony.
Over the unusually long life cycle of last gen. Thanks to Microsoft famously fucking up at the Xbox One right out the gate, Sony was able to win over an entire generation almost immediately with a spectacular roasting with the PS4 at their E3 debut, and then later following up with a wish fulfillment E3 with Shenmue 3, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Last Guardian. However, this would mark the end of Sony's return to glory, as the good guy console of the PS4 is now well over 90 million units sold, and probably close to the original lifetime sales of the PlayStation 1. And with its recovered success, arrogant Sony has also recovered. The first sign of arrogant Sony's return might be the increase in the PlayStation Plus subscription. Not only was the PSN free last generation, but after introducing a pay-to-play online system with the PS4, they have increased it from within the same generation. Similar to that raw deal, Sony also recently stopped handing out free promotional titles for PS3 and Vita games, bringing the content PSN brings in each month from 6 games down to 2. But perhaps most perplexing of all is how Sony has handled crossplay. While it's certainly a hot topic now, its roots go all the way back to the Dreamcast and Quake 3. For most of console gaming's life, crossplay wasn't really thought about. However, due to the success of multiplayer titles and the ever-increasing online presence of them, most titles have decided to implement crossplay. Surprisingly, Microsoft was on board with this idea, and when presented to Nintendo, even they didn't care. Sony, however, dug its heels into the closed platform stance. When asked about it, Sony responded with the usual claims of quality control and safety for the users, which was rightfully called out that even Nintendo was allowing it. The push got so bad that Sony eventually caved in on allowing crossplay, but so far only for Fortnite and Rocket League. Things got even more heated when Sony claimed it was a developer decision, and developers were quick to point out that they asked and Sony told them no. Little movement has been made since, and non-Sony games, both big and small, continue to be able to play across systems, while Sony limits its audience to only PSN users. However, when you're sitting on about 100 million systems sold, Sony might see little incentive to worry. And like the ghost of Christmas past, the stench of Sony's stance on games like BMX XXX has come back to haunt us, with new approval process guidelines that Sony has been placing on top of ESRB ratings. This manifested itself first with visual novel titles that had to have a little more extra covering up on Sony platforms, but not on the Switch. Eyebrows would start to raise more when an updated version of Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball 3 was set to be released this year. However, 2 items from the original PS4 release had to be cut out for the new version, but those 2 items would be present in the new Nintendo Switch version. Things would get more noticeable when
one thing that really galls me about this censorship aspect, too, is that if you look back historically and everything, and you pull back the curtain and you reverse the tides back to, nostalgia for the NES era and the SNES era, you would have almost bet money that, Nintendo was the company that was more friendly to censorship and wanted to maintain a much more family-friendly, atmosphere on the console. Although, to be honest with you, I've noticed that there's a split at Sony and everything in regards to censorship. Now, if you make your characters as realistic looking as possible, they're going to allow for nudity and that sort of thing, and those sorts of things. But if you make them anime style, suddenly they're going to be up in arms about censoring it and everything, and that's weird, to say the least. It's very, when you look at, often when you look at what people actually censor and everything, you find yourself taking a look at it, and you notice oddities like that, you're like, why is one thing okay and one thing isn't, you know? And anyways, why are we censoring sex far more than we are violence, you know? Now, I get violence has to be an integral part of these games, otherwise what the hell is the fucking challenge and everything, but, you know, there are plenty of places in movies, like, for instance, that can operate without it, and yet there's so much of it. It's such a violence-generated culture that and nobody ever objects to violence, but sex? A-okay.
Devil May Cry 5 on Xbox and PC had a small cutscene where we had the briefest of glimpses of Trish's ass crack, but mysterious J.J. Abrams'
They're always censoring it. Like,
rays were covering that bit of ungodliness on the PS4 version. Strangely enough, a recent patch has removed the Abrams rays on the PS4 version, letting everyone stare in horror on the new playthroughs going forward. This particular issue is one that I have the least attachment to, but nonetheless, I do find it extremely puzzling. If content is approved by the ESRB or CERO or even PEGI, I'm not sure why Sony feels the need to step in further. Ultimately, however, I feel it's just another symptom of arrogant Sony. And this is where it all culminates for me. Arrogant Sony is bad for the industry.
one thing that I will say about this is that these companies are acting like the only people who play and adopt their consoles are all minors. That the only people that are still playing games at this point are minors, and that adults have never played video games, and that they're not playing it for entertainment anymore, and that, you know, people outgrow video games, and that it's no longer their hobby when they turn into an adult. Now, I have to say that that reality and that thought has not held true at all. There are plenty of adults playing video games these days.
It limits gameplay potential for multiplayer titles. It prevents certain titles from releasing worldwide, and it makes developers wary of creating titles when the largest platform in town has unclear rules of what is and is not okay. Now, this is not to say that others make good decisions either. Nintendo is famous for screwing over third parties during their near monopoly of the game industry 30 years ago. Which is why arrogant anybody is bad for video games. It's bad for developers, it's bad for buyers, and ultimately limits the potential of such a vastly creative industry. Sadly, there's really no good answers for arrogant Sony other than to vote with your wallet. If you enjoy the features of games being offered on non-Sony versions, then buy those other versions. An arrogant Sony will not change with continued success. As next gen rapidly approaches, let's hope we can all leave arrogant Sony where it belongs, in the buried past, with
One of the reasons why, you know, I end up finding myself in a position where I'm interested in seeing the PlayStation 5 hacked at this point is that it is a very powerful piece of hardware, but apparently nothing that I actually want to play has been released for it. Now, if some hackers go in and it ends up being the product of the homebrew community, and the homebrew community actually comes up with an RPG that is compelling and everything, spam my comment section about it. Reach out to me privately. You know, ask me for an email or something and everything. I'll be happy to find a way to, you know, at least obscure it so that I can offer it to you and everything, since YouTube doesn't have private messages, as far as I know, and everything. I do want to keep it private, but I'd probably use a redirection route before giving you my real one and everything, you know, one of those relay systems. And then, you know, with that, once you email that, I'd give you my real one with that information. Or you can just drop your email in my comment section and I'll reach out to you myself.